We come at last to the ruin of Doriath, a tale of treachery and torment and treason. This is not a story about orcs or trolls or wicked men, it's a tale about elves and what happens when elves choose evil. Maya, Govan and Melanine, and welcome to the final episode in the series explaining and breaking down Tolkien's epic First Age tale of the Silmaril of Doriath. Today, I'm going to explore one of the darkest and most desperate moments in the entire history of the Elder Days, something Tolkien described in 1920 as the first premeditated war of elfin folk upon elfin folk. In some ways, this can be thought of as Middle-earth's first elvish civil war. It's remembered to history as the second Kinslaying. However, just before I get into the details of this amazing but horrifying story, first I need to talk very briefly about its history. As I just mentioned, Tolkien was writing about this as far back as 1920, 1919 even. It's an old element of the legendarium, but like so much of Doriath's story, it wasn't fully updated before he died. Which means there are a few details, and we're talking about like literally single sentences, that do appear to have been put into the story by Christopher Tolkien rather than his father, the Professor. In my opinion, these are excellent additions, and they make the story more compelling and cohesive. And let me stress again, they are minor additions. But I do feel obliged to mention them. The two paragraphs that this episode is going to be all about are probably the least quote-unquote reliable paragraphs in perhaps the entire Silmarillion. And yet, honestly, this is one of my favourite parts of it. This is an episode I've been really excited to get to since before I even started Tolkien Untangled. So, the skeleton of this episode will be built around the published Silmarillion version of the story, but I will also mention some details from those other writings. Anyway, our finale begins with the Sons of Feanor. Deep inside Dior Elukiel's woodland kingdom, Feanor's Silmaril burns again. His son's oath burns with it. New Doriath, or as has been suggested, Doriath, is made great and fair by the power of the Silmaril, but the Sons of Feanor won't let that stop them. They don't care about the kingdom of the Sindar, all they want is their father's jewel. So, the first thing they do after gathering again is send a message to the young king of Doriath. They tell him of their claim to the Silmaril, and they demand that he surrender it to them. In the very earliest version of the story, Curufin the Crafty travelled to Doriath on his own to treat with Dior in person. This detail isn't mentioned in any other version, but it doesn't feel out of place in the later Silmarillion version. However, if we accept this as true, it does imply quite a lack of good faith among the Sons of Feanor. In the Silmarillion version, Curufin has already attempted murder upon both of Dior's parents. He tried kidnapping Dior's mother twice, and not too long ago, he was threatening to destroy all the people of Doriath. I'm just saying, there are other brothers who might have proved a more diplomatic choice. Like Maglor, for example. You know, the nice one. Maybe he and Dior actually could have sat down and worked something out. But I should point out, what I'm doing here is taking two different versions of two different stories and smushing them together. Curufin only came to treat with Dior in the earliest version of this story, but in the earliest version of Beren and Luthien, written a year or two earlier than this, Curufin isn't even mentioned. Celegorm and Curufin only became Beren and Luthien's antagonists upon later revisions. So, once again, we do have a little bit of wiggle room in how we choose to imagine this. Anyway, in all versions, Dior either rejects the Sons of Feanor's claim, or he gives no answer. he refuses to surrender his parents' Silmaril. And you may be thinking, that makes him a bit of a moron, which I suppose might be a fair take. I will admit there's potentially some pride at play, but I want to take a moment to defend Dior's decision here. Celegorm and Curafine are monsters. They have spent decades threatening to slaughter all of Doriath's people. Not sack its halls, not raid its borders, genocide. And I just don't think good people should reward terrorists by giving them what they want. I hear people argue the Silmarils belong to the Sons of Feanor by right, and I do understand where they're coming from, but if we want to get into the topic of what's right, I would make the case the Silmarils belong by right to all the people of the Blessed Realm. The thing that makes those jewels special is the divine light inside them, and Feanor did not create that light. He did not hallow them and make them sacred. All he did was very cleverly capture the light in crystal. When Morgoth destroyed the two trees, the source of the magical light, Feanor could have and should have cracked open his Silmarils and restored the divine light to the Blessed Realm. If he had, he would have been remembered forever as the greatest hero of the Eldar. He would have lived up to his potential as the greatest craftsman ever, and he would have rescued the Elder Days from a whole lot of literal and figurative darkness. But instead he chose selfish, possessive pride. He refused to give up his shiny rocks, and he declared he would hold on to them forever and ever and ever. Hilariously, immediately after that, the Silmarils were stolen by Morgoth. I think we can all agree Morgoth has no moral claim to them, he's like the embodiment of evil, but then came Beren. And with the help of Luthien, he cut one Silmaril from the Dark Lord's crown. He did not do so out of greed. He was not motivated by desire to possess a Silmaril. He pulled off the impossible because he was driven by love. He had Iluvatar on his side. The Silmaril didn't burn his flesh. He was deemed worthy of it. I would argue when the Silmaril falls from Morgoth's crown into Beren's hand, he becomes its rightful owner. He does then give it freely to Elu Thingol, and I'm not convinced Thingol's motives for possessing it were 100% pure. I do agree with Melian that maybe he should have just given it to the Sons of Feanor a few decades ago, but that was before they threatened to slaughter all his subjects, and it's irrelevant to Dior. Dior did not inherit the Silmaril from his grandfather's slightly dubious claim. He inherited it from his parents after they died. After they took it from Morgoth. It is true, maybe violence might have been averted if Dior surrendered the Jewel of Beren and Luthien to the Sons of Feanor. But that kind of utilitarian morality isn't the kind of morality that interested Tolkien. Within the ethical framework of Middle-earth, right and wrong really matter in and of themselves. They are not just a means to either positive or negative outcomes. Regardless of anyone's claim, Dior has, I think, the highest right to bear a Silmaril. I stand with Dior Elukil. And I guess, right, the point I'm trying to make is that if the Sons of Feanor really want a Silmaril that badly, there are still two others in Morgoth's crown. If they're that interested in what's right, maybe they should start with them. Anyway, unsurprisingly, I guess, the brothers do not take King Dior's no for an answer. They move to Plan B. This is the first of those occasions where I should point out an area in which the story evolved over Tolkien's life. As his conception of the Sons of Feanor grew, he decided to turn one of them into a much more likeable, interesting, and compelling character, while turning another one into one of his most despicable villains. The dichotomy between Maedhros the Tall and Celegorm the Fair is, I think, fascinating. In some ways, these two brothers can be thought of as being quite similar. They're both leaders, they're both particularly epic warriors, they are both stated to be remarkably good-looking, they're both hot-tempered, charismatic, and intelligent, and they both take part in many of the same deeds. And yet in other ways, they are entirely opposed. In the Silmarillion, Maedhros, along with Maglor, comes across as a fundamentally good person who is driven towards darkness by an oath that he regrets and resents. Celegorm, on the other hand, along with Curufin, seems to revel in wrongdoing. Maedhros demonstrates an abundance of self-control, often restraining his brothers, whereas Celegorm seldom shows any restraint and is usually the one inciting his brothers to wickedness. Maedhros builds alliances and brings people together. Celegorm makes enemies and causes problems. Even in his darkest moments, Maedhros holds on to some honor. Celegorm's baseline is cruelty. It kind of feels like the Sons of Feanor have had two possible leaders, Maedhros trying his best to guide them forward positively, and Celegorm dragging them backwards towards treachery. I guess Maglor will always side with Maedhros, and Curufin will always side with Celegorm, but the hearts and minds and souls of Corinthia and Amras do seem to be up for grabs. We aren't told if there was much debate or disagreement among the brothers after Dior refused to surrender the Silmaril, but we do know, in this case, it was Celegorm's influence that prevailed. He stirred up his brothers, he stirred up their fighters, and he plotted an assault upon the resurrected kingdom of Doriath. There are two versions of what followed. In older texts left out of the Silmarillion, we are told there was a battle. Dior's host marched to the eastern border of Doriath, and at Yule they fought to defend their home from the army of the Sons of Feanor. In the Silmarillion, things are a little different. There is no battle for Doriath, there is simply a massacre in Menegroth. During the depths of winter, the Sons of Feanor and all those who fight with them came in secret to the Thousand Caves, and before Dior or his people even knew what was happening, the slaughter of the second Kinslaying got started. In my mind, this is one of the most unforgivably awful things ever to happen in the Elder Days. Lots of innocent people are murdered. A great kingdom is brought to ruin, and Morgoth, seemingly, isn't to blame. He loses 0 orcs. He unleashes no army. He puts forward none of his power. His enemies just tear each other apart without him. It's debatable whether this is the worst deed performed by any elves ever, but certainly I think it's up there. In the case of Doriath, the Oath of Feanor brings more ruin than the Dark Lord does. This is a story about elves murdering elves. And the first murdered elf I want to mention, because this makes me so angry, is the innocent and loving Lady Nimloth, Queen of New Doriath, wife of Dior Elukil, and mother to 3 young children. We know absolutely no details about what exactly happened to Queen Nimloth. The entirety of the Second Kinslaying is summed up in 3 sentences, but we know she was slain in it. There's no evidence to suggest she was a combatant. I certainly don't imagine her armed and armoured. I imagine her being cut down by either Celegorm or Curufin or one of their cruel servants, simply because she stood between them and their lust for her husband Silmaril. Imagine the murder of Queen Nimloth from the perspectives of either Dior, her husband, Galathiel, her father, or Celeborn, her uncle. She did nothing wrong. She had no relation to any of the Feanorians, yet they killed her in their kinslaying anyway. I should point out, the death of Nimloth isn't actually mentioned in any of Tolkien's writings, apart from the published Silmarillion, so it seems to me this detail was probably added by Christopher Tolkien for the sake of tying up a loose end. In a few other writings, which do contradict what's written in the Silmarillion, Dior's wife is called Lindis, and in one of those writings she actually survives the second kinslaying. One could potentially argue maybe that is closer to what the professor actually intended, but the truth is, because of this story's fragmentary nature, it's impossible to talk about what definitely is or isn't canon, and in the most official, in air quotes, version, Lindis is called Nimloth and she is murdered in Menegroth. Anyway, if you're outraged already at the murder of this innocent mother, I'm afraid I don't really know what to tell you. We are only at the tip of this abominable iceberg. Just wait till you hear what they did to her sons. I doubt this is going to surprise anyone, but at the heart of this diabolical crime stands Celegorm the Fair, along with his cruel servants. On their master's instruction, we are told these servants seize the 6-year-old boys, Elured and Elurine, kidnap them from Menegroth, and then leave them to starve in the forest, in midwinter, during a massacre, without any girdle or guardians or even grown-ups to protect them. And, right, forgetting for just 1 second how evil it is to do that to a pair of children, it's also entirely unnecessary. In fact, it's worse than unnecessary, it's counterproductive to the Sons of Feanor's agenda. If Celegorm weren't the worst of the worst, maybe he would have figured out that kidnapping Elured and Elurine and then keeping them safe, ransoming them back to King Dior in exchange for the Silmaril, would have been an infinitely better idea than murdering them, slowly, through negligence. I have to assume Celegorm realised this, and I have to assume he was so confident he'd end up with the Silmaril either way, he instructed his cruel servants to just let these boys starve to death in wintry woods. That's just who he is, I guess. Irredeemable. This part of the story always makes me want to jump into the pages of the Silmarillion and just punch Celegorm in his stupid, fair face. I despise him so much. Anyway, calm down, David. It's not actually real. There is another detail that I need to talk about here, because when Maedhros learned what Celegorm's cruel servants had done to these vulnerable children, his conscience was stricken. He broke from the rest of his brothers. He gave up on the slaughter and the mission and the reason for assaulting Menegroth in the first place. He went into the woods and he searched for Elured and Elurine. They might be his enemies' children, but he refuses to just abandon them and let them die. I would presume Maglor also went with Maedhros and also tried to do the right thing, but the truth is, Maglor is never mentioned in any capacity during the second kinslaying, so all we can do is speculate on how he might have behaved. Either way though, tragically, Maedhros never found any sign of Dior and Nimloth's sons. His search was unavailing, and of the fate of Elured and Elurine, no tale tells. As I see it, there are 3 possibilities for what might have happened to them. The likeliest option, which I hate, a less likely option, which is at least supported by some of Tolkien's writings, and a least likely option, which I really enjoy, but I have to admit is less of a theory and more just me clutching at straws. I reckon the likeliest option, sadly, is they died, lost and afraid in freezing woods, which is obscene. But it is backed up by a 1968 essay in which we are told Elured and Elurine, before they came to manhood, were both slain. However, Tolkien himself did later reject much of that essay, and in an earlier draft of the story we are told, although nothing is known of their fate, some say wild birds of the woods found these 2 boys and aided them in their desperate plight. According to this early idea, forest birds, perhaps Melian's former songbirds, led the children to food and water, and eventually Elured and Elurine followed them all the way south back to Osirion, back to the warmer lands that they were born in. This is still quite a long way from optimistic, but it is nice to imagine, perhaps, after the twins made it back to their original home, Osirion's green elves may have adopted them and taken care of Beren and Lúthien's only grandsons in secret. It's not exactly likely, but there is some textual evidence, so it is possible. And speaking of not likely, but technically possible, there is a third hypothetical for what might have happened to Elured and Elurine, which I really enjoy imagining, but I must state again, I don't think it's what Tolkien intended. Anyway, here is what we know. 6,500 years after these 2 little half-elves got lost in the wood while facing desperate peril, 2 little hobbits, called Merry and Pippin, also got lost in the woods while facing desperate peril, and when that happened, Merry and Pippin were rescued by an Ent, Treebeard. We know Treebeard was alive in Beleriand at this time. We know he once wandered in woodlands both to the north of Doriath and to the south of it. We know Elured and Elurine's grandparents were friends of Ents. Beren called on the Ents to aid him in battle only 3 years ago. And we know when Treebeard found Merry and Pippin during The Lord of the Rings, he said to them, "I heard your voices. I liked them. Nice little voices. They reminded me of something I cannot remember." What if the hobbits' little voices reminded Treebeard of Elured and Elurine's little voices all those thousands of years ago? What if he, or some other Ent, or even an Ent wife, chanced upon the twins and took pity on them, liked their little voices too? What if Dior and Nimloth's sons survived the ruin of Doriath and went on to live rich lives as Ent wards, learning to speak Entish, forgetting their first 6 years as half-elvish princelings and spending the rest of their time in Middle-earth together as hasty little Ent friends? It's much more likely that they died horribly, but isn't it so much more beautiful to imagine that when Treebeard encounters Merry and Pippin in Fangorn Forest, hearing their voices before he sees them, the first place his mind goes to is an almost forgotten memory of Elured and Elurine speaking together almost 6,500 years earlier. Anyway, whatever fate did befall the twins, no tale tells of it, and so all we can do is choose a preferred interpretation. But while that interpretation is happening within the woods of Doriath, within the 1,000 caves of Menegroth, the Kinslaying rages on. Caranthea the Dark fights the Sindar in their own capital city. Presumably, Amroth the Hunter does too. I would love to talk details, but once again, I'm afraid we don't get any. However, if I were adapting this story into a film or TV show, I would definitely take this opportunity to dramatize what must have been, I believe, an incredibly intense reunion between the sons of Feanor and their cousin, the Lady Galadriel. At the beginning of the Silmarillion, Galadriel had a closer relationship with her uncle Feanor than almost anyone else in her family. It was her hair that inspired Feanor to create the Silmarils in the first place. She was the only woman who initially joined him in his rebellion. She journeyed beside him to Alqualonde. She stood with his sons, and there she discovered exactly how far they're all willing to go to fulfill their oath. They committed the first kinslaying. Galadriel was horrified. Immediately she turned against them. She fought in defense of Alqualonde's people, her mother's kin. Then she parted ways with her wicked uncle and her oath-bound cousins, and she came to Middle-earth instead with her other uncle's host. She settled in Doriath. She fell in love with Celeborn, a prince of Doriath. She gained the trust of Doriath's king, her great-uncle on her mother's side. She studied under Queen Melian and learned much wisdom. She lived in peace. She probably befriended Luthien. She probably knew Dior and Nimloth. She probably cared for their children. Nimloth is her husband's niece. Until, suddenly, one day, she finds herself once again face to face with Feanorians, her cousins, the kin she once stood beside, now come to murder her family, her friends, her people, in their home. This is Alqualonde all over again. But for Galadriel, it's even more personal this time. Beloved Celeborn is among the Sindar that her cousins, the sons of Feanor, are trying to slay. She turned against them the first time, but now, 554 years later, she's not just against them, she's diametrically opposed. The Noldor's mightiest daughter stands against her Noldorine cousins, for she has grown into a guardian and a leader and a great lady among the Sindar. As I explained at length in the first episode in the series, according to The Lord of the Rings, Galadriel wasn't even in Doriath during the second kinslaying, and according to the Silmarillion, well, we have no idea what she was doing because Tolkien never finished updating it. To quote directly from the Unfinished Tales, there is no part of the history of Middle-earth more full of problems than the story of Galadriel and Celeborn. So, whatever we choose to believe, we will be contradicting something else. And if we only accept the facts that Tolkien explicitly stated about her, the truth is that Galadriel's backstory is really quite lackluster throughout the vast majority of Middle-earth's history. It can be summed up as she spent most of her 8,000-year-long life busily doing nothing far away from where all the interesting things are happening. But Galadriel is one of Tolkien's most beloved characters. And if the Professor had finished updating the Silmarillion after The Lord of the Rings, I'm certain he would have written her an interesting character arc. He started one. Obviously, I have no idea what Tolkien would have done with Galadriel if he'd written more, but I think the most straightforward version of her First Age story would have been for her to remain in Doriath with Celeborn and witness its ruin. Just by dint of being present at the second kinslaying, I think a wonderful character arc emerges. The Noldor inflict violence upon the Sindar, but Galadriel of the Noldor resists them. She rejects that side of her heritage entirely and fully embraces her Sindar husband, her Sindar people, and her Cinder homeland. Anyway, if I were adapting this for a film or TV show, I think I would showcase a duel between Lord Celeborn and Caranthir the Dark. Celeborn is perhaps the most quintessential Sindar left in the story, very tall, silver-haired kinsman of Eleuthingol, and Caranthir, more so than even the rest of his brothers, demonstrated particular disdain for the Sindar when he first arrived in Middle-earth. Also, let's not forget about Celeborn's brother. Galathiel is never mentioned anywhere again. There are a few princes of the Sindar who do play a significant role in the Second Age, like Orather and Thranduil, but Galathiel is not among them. You are free to imagine whatever you want, but I think the simplest explanation for Galathiel's fate would be that he died along with his daughter in the second kinslaying. And if that's the case, it certainly does fortify Celeborn's motive to seek out a son of Feanor in battle. Honestly, though, the main reason I am suggesting an invented Celeborn-Caranthir duel is because in the Silmarillion, Tolkien did write, "In the 1,000 caves of Menegroth, Caranthir the Dark was slain." We have no idea who actually landed the killing blow, but I choose to believe it was Celeborn, the last surviving descendant of Prince Elmo, avenging both Nimloth and Galathiel, as well as plenty of others in Doriath, by taking out Feanor's darkest son, protecting his people. And before moving on, I have one more character to speculate on here. What about Amras the Hunter? Unlike Caranthir, Amras survived the second kinslaying. We will see him again. But, as I explained last time, I think the story is improved if we go with a later and more sinister version where Amras's twin brother, Amrod, was accidentally burned alive 534 years ago. The version where Amras has been living under the wing of Caranthir the Dark and is slowly teetering further and further into darkness of his own. If we accept that version, this is the second time Amras has lost the brother he's closest to. In my interpretation of events, this moment, Caranthir's death, strips Amras of his last shreds of innocence. The next time we see him, the implication, at least, will be he is a straight-up villain. Anyway, the next of Feanor's sons who I need to talk about is Curufin the Crafty, one of the most despicable elves ever to live. Throughout the entire story, everywhere Curufin goes, he ends up making worse. He was Feanor's favourite son, and the one who most resembled his father in skill, temperament, and appearance. He's as clever as he is vindictive, talented, bad-tempered, and treacherous. I've already talked about his murderous levels of spite, but the thing I want to focus on right now, remember Nargothrond, the elvish halls of Finrod Felagund that later fell to Glaurung the dragon? Well, don't forget, Curufin, along with Celegorm, used to live in Nargothrond. It was his home. He lived there with his son, Celebrimbor, Feanor's only grandchild, and for a while he was a respected voice within Nargothrond. After his treachery was revealed, the hearts of the Nargothrondrim were released from Curufin and Celegorm's influence. The brothers were sent packing, but young Celebrimbor repudiated his father's wickedness. He chose to remain among the folk of Nargothrond. The reason I mention this, 30 years after Curufin saw his son Celebrimbor for the final time, Nargothrond was conquered by Glaurung. A great many of its people were slaughtered. We know, obviously, Celebrimbor was not among them, but I don't see how Curufin could have, And in the War of the Jewels, we are explicitly told when news of Nargothron's fall reached the sons of Feanor, Maedhros was dismayed by it. This is because Maedhros is a decent person with an at least somewhat functioning moral compass. But this same news about the violent destruction of his former home where his son is living did not at all displease Curufin. During the second Kinslaying, this crafty, venomous, malignant piece of filth got himself killed. And it's very important to me that we all take a moment here to consciously choose to be not at all displeased by it. Curufin went to Doriath with murder on his mind, and quite frankly, he got what he deserved. We have no idea who gets the distinction of being the one to remove Curufin from Middle-earth forever. Maybe it was just some humble unnamed Sindar who saw an opportunity and took it. But I'll put forward two potential candidates who might be interesting to imagine filling this role. Firstly, King Dior, right? I mean, Curufin tried to murder both Beren and Luthien in the past. Wouldn't it be great if their son was the one who finally did him in? My other candidate is a little bit more controversial, and I'm actually slightly conflicted about even suggesting it, but I do think there might be something quite powerful if Curufin were ultimately slain by his cousin Galadriel. I know some fans really reject the idea of warrior Galadriel, some others buy into it. My personal take is more with the former. I think she's a much more interesting character if we view her as a protector who enriches and enhances her allies, but seldom ever takes part in violence herself. However, I could potentially be convinced Curufin might be the singular exception. You know, the son who is most like Feanor in mood and look and genocidal intent. It seems to me, if she had chosen very differently, Galadriel could have become a bit like a female Curufin. She could have been Feanor's favourite. She could have been his prideful, selfish follower. She could have been the mightiest Feanorian. But Galadriel passes the tests that she's presented with. Over and over she made the right choices while Curufin chose evil. And now she is his perfect opposite. This is all just speculation, but perhaps while Celeborn was busy battling Caranthir in one of Menegoth's many caves, Curufin made an attempt on Dior's daughter, Elwing, only 3 years old. Her mother is dead. Her brothers are lost. Her father is fighting, but maybe the Lady Galadriel is guarding her. Perhaps Curufin recognizes his cousin. Last time they saw each other was at Alqualonde, but before that they were close, similar even in terms of interest and skill and ambition. Perhaps Curufin tries to get a read of her. A former Feanorian, one of the mighty Noldor. He decides surely she won't slay him just to save a Sindar half-elf. Deep down, he presumes they want the same thing, right? To rule a realm in Middle-earth, to fulfill the prideful dreams they once shared with his father. But he miscalculates. What Galadriel truly wants is to protect and preserve that which is fair. As Curufin's sword flashes towards young Elwing, Galadriel faces a choice. A test. If she were to throw a spear into Curufin to save little Elwing, mightn't she also be slaying the last piece of her desire to be Feanor's successor? She would determine instead to be forever Melion's successor. It's not exactly a character arc that Tolkien wrote, but it's an arc that reveals itself in the imagination without too much invention. There are 1,000 ways we could envision Curufin dying in the second Kinslaying, and it would be pretty epic if King Dior were responsible. Also, if you choose to imagine Curufin slipping down a flight of stairs and splatting onto the ground, I ain't gonna tell you the character deserves better. But if you do buy into the speculation that Galadriel and Celeborn were present in Doriath at this time, I think we have to imagine the second Kinslaying was one of the formative moments in their lives. An absolute turning point for both of them. Anyway, all of this brings us at last to the other evil son of Feanor's, Celegorm the Fair, the guy who got the slaughter going. Unlike Caranthir, Curufin, Maglor, and Amras, there actually are one or two details we know for certain about Celegorm in the second Kinslaying. After sending his cruel servants to dispose of Elured and Elurine, Celegorm seeks out their father. He crosses blades with King Dior. I have an enormous number of negative things to say about Celegorm, but I can't deny the guy's a good fighter. Back in Valinor, his father and most of his brothers were followers of Aule, the valor of crafting, but Celegorm is no craftsman. He is a hunter. We are told he was a friend of Oromes, the valor of the hunt, and during the battle under Starlight, the Dagor Nuin Gileath, the first battle in the War of the Jewels, Celegorm demonstrated his military prowess by dismaying the Dark Lord and driving a host of his orcs into marshland before wiping them out entirely. He's a bad person, but he is good at killing. Worth pointing out, though, in the Silmarillion, we are explicitly told neither Celegorm nor any of his other brothers dared to assail Luthien for the Silmaril while she was wearing it. Celegorm already got his ass handed to him by Beren and Luthien once in the past, and I think it's telling that he and his brothers choose not to attack Tol Galen while Luthien lived there. They waited out her mortal clock like cowards, and then they attacked her son and his family instead. Not a good look. Anyway, we aren't told how much King Dior knew of Celegorm's history with his parents, but we are told in the 1,000 Caves of Menegroth, the capital of his resurrected kingdom, Dior the Fair and Celegorm the Fair fought a duel to the death. When their battle was over, the ground was stained red. Celegorm demanded the Silmaril of Dior. He brought devastation and destruction to Doriath, and as a consequence of that, he died there, at Dior's hand. Sadly, Dior isn't a character who gets all that much to do in the great tales of the Elder Days, but he will always be the legend who plunged a sword into Celegorm, who forever rid Middle-earth of one of its worst elves ever. 40 years earlier, Celegorm kidnapped Dior's mother. He tried to force her to marry him. He tried to murder Dior's father. He threatened war upon Dior's grandfather. He brought wholesale carnage upon Dior's people, and then Dior Elukil showed him what justice looks like. Celegorm tried to kinslay his way into possessing Dior's Silmaril, and not only did it cost him his life, it cost Curufin's and Caranthir's too. Let's try and find Middle-earth's tiniest violin. Tolkien wrote, after the second Kinslaying, the sons of Feanor gained not what they sought. 3 of them never returned from the ruins of Doriath, and of the 3 who did, Maedhros, Maglor, and Amras, also Amrod in the Silmarillion version, none walked away with anything to show for it. All they achieved was the total, perpetual, and final ruin of Doriath. After the coming of the sons of Feanor, this kingdom never rises again. Doriath is destroyed. Because although King Dior fought valiantly in defense of his home, and although he succeeded in slaying the leader of his foes, as well as possibly Curufin and Caranthea too, we just don't know, ultimately, he gave his life to do so. By the time the second Kinslaying concluded, Dior Elukil also lay dead. For the survivors of Doriath, this is an insurmountable catastrophe. Their king is slain. Their queen is slain. Their princes are lost and presumed slain. All the descendants of Thingol and Melian are now dead. Except for one. Before the kinslaying began, Dior bestowed his family's Silmaril to his 3-year-old daughter, Elwing. She survived the slaughter in Menegroth, and so the Silmaril survived too. It remained with the Sindar, with Beren and Luthien's granddaughter, and the sons of Feanor never did get it from her. There are a few different versions of how Elwing escaped the ruin of Doriath, but they're all very similar and they all end the same way. Faithful survivors rescued her. They fled with her and her Silmaril, and they departed their homeland forever. As Doriath fell, the last of its people journeyed south, and they brought their orphaned half-elvish princess to the havens of Sirion, far away on the southern coast. Who these faithful survivors were, we are never told. There is that one version where Lady Nimloth was known as Lindis, and she survived the kinslaying, bringing her daughter to the havens herself, but that directly contradicts the Silmarillion version, and although it does seem nice, Lindis is never mentioned again. She contributes absolutely nothing else to the story, and I think there's more emotional weight in the version where Nimloth dies, along with her husband, and maybe her father and her sons in Doriath. Also, I totally do have a bit of an ulterior motive for saying that, because I believe by far the best answer to the question, which surviving elves of Doriath rescue Elwing and bring her safely into the south, is Galadriel and Celeborn. You're free to disagree, but I truly think this is the trajectory Galadriel and Celeborn's First Age story should take. It perfectly sets up the characters we know they'll become in the Second Age, and I think it harmonises beautifully with what they'll grow into in the Third Age. And considering the direction of the story Tolkien started weaving into the Silmarillion but never finished, this also strikes me as the simplest conclusion to be drawn out. And even Christopher Tolkien kind of agreed. In The Unfinished Tales, he wrote, "It is a natural assumption that Celeborn and Galadriel were present at the ruin of Doriath. It is said in one place that Celeborn escaped the sack of Doriath, and perhaps aided the escape of Elwing to the havens of Sirion with the Silmaril. We just can't say for certain. But Elwing is the great-granddaughter of Thingol and Melian. She is the granddaughter of Beren and Luthien. She is also the granddaughter of Celeborn's brother Galathiel. She is the daughter of Celeborn's niece, which means Celeborn is her great-uncle. His relationship to Elwing is the same as Elu Thingol's relationship to him. It makes so much sense for Celeborn and Galadriel to be the ones that bear young, vulnerable Elwing away from the ruins of her home. To be the ones who don't claim the Silmaril after Dior's death, but simply guard it, along with his daughter, the only legacy he has left. It makes so much sense for Galadriel to guide Doriath's survivors to the Havens of Sirion, where she can introduce them to the son of her cousin from her other uncle, Fëanor's brother, future High King of the Noldor, Gil-galad, or in some versions, her nephew, Gil-galad. In some versions, her great-nephew. Gil-galad's parentage is tricky, but at these havens, Celeborn can also reintroduce the Sindar to his grandfather's kinsman, Círdan the Shipwright, the guy in charge of these havens. Tolkien never states it, but I think the strongest ending to this deep, dark story is to have Galadriel and Celeborn, along with Gil-galad and Círdan, committing themselves to the protection and preservation of a scattering of refugees, while guarding and guiding a 3-year-old princess, the new bearer of the Silmaril of Doriath. Please do not forget about Elwing. She won't be in the next series, but we will see her again, and when she is fully grown, she will become one half of the epic union that brings the First Age to its end. This little girl has quite the destiny still to come. But with that said, we really have arrived at the end of this story. Doriath is gone. Forever. Nargothrond is gone too. Brethiel is gone. Amon-Rûdh is gone. Dorthonion is gone. Thargelion and Himlad and Hithlum have all fallen. Dor-lómin is conquered. All of Beleriand seems under Morgoth's boot heel. Apart from desperate refugees at the Havens of Sirion, there's basically nothing left, except for a secret, hidden city. There is one star in the blackness of Morgoth's night, one island in his ocean of darkness, one last bastion, all alone in the heart of the Dark Lord's Empire. It's finally time to talk about Gondolin, the last of the great tales that make up the Elder Days, one of the most unbelievably epic things Tolkien ever wrote. And that is what the next First Age Explained series is going to be all about. We will meet Glorfindel and Ecthelion of the Fountain. We'll meet two elves who are arguably even more evil than Celegorm and Curufin, and we will all develop very strong feelings for the children of Húrin's considerably more charming cousin. So, to make sure you don't miss everything that's still to come, hit subscribe if you haven't already, and be sure to click like and leave a comment on this video if you want to. You can also now support the channel on Patreon or Ko-fi if you'd like to, so follow the links in the description to those pages if you are at all interested. And a great big thank you to all of you who have already donated. I really hope you all enjoyed this Silmaril of Doriath series, but until next time, as always, my dear friends, much love. Stay groovy and Navair Melanin.